Welcome, everyone. My name is Judy White, and I'm a psychologist and a dream worker. Today, it's my pleasure and privilege to introduce Lauren Schneider. Lauren is a brilliant psychotherapist and a humble mystic who, in the course of her over 3-decade career, has developed the methodology of Tarotpy, a unique synthesis of therapy, tarot, and dream work. Lauren is also my colleague and dear friend, so I can personally attest to the power and inspiration of the book, Tarotpy. It's all in the cards. A pathway to inner wisdom, divine guidance, and profound healing. That's her new book, and she beautifully describes Tarotpy in it. And she's here today to talk to us about it. Lauren will begin this program, this launch, by talking about, telling Tarotpy's origin story, really. Then she and I will be in conversation for a bit. We'll save the last part of the program to open it up to you all for questions. And feel free to put questions in the chat at any time. We're grateful that our co-host, Ellen Wolf, will be taking care of the Zoom platform and monitoring questions. Thank you so much, Ellen. We're asking for everybody to keep yourselves muted for the duration of the program. We also want to let you know that this launch is being recorded for anyone who can't make the live presentation. Lauren, I'm going to turn it over to you. And I'm sure everyone is excited to hear what you have to share.
Judy, thank you so much. Am I on screen with you here? I just want to say I am so thrilled that everyone is here, that I can share Tarotpy with you. Judy, I am so honored and grateful to be in conversation with you, and so grateful to Ellen for co-hosting. So I really want to welcome everyone and say that whether you're a psychotherapist, a dreamer, a tarot enthusiast, or somebody with no familiarity with these images, this book was written with you in mind. It can teach you Tarotpy to use for your own spiritual practice or to work with clients. If you're a clinician, I have found Tarotpy over 35 years to be a remarkable tool for, again, whether it's for personal use or for clients, to open up the unconscious, connect with a higher consciousness, and lay the unconscious on the table. How I came to receiving the cards, I'm going to let you read in the, in the prologue. But I'm going to start the story today in terms of how Tarotpy evolved by saying that in 1982, I walked into a fairly conventional master's program for marriage and family therapy with tarot in one pocket and the I Ching in the other. I did not know what these divination tools were. I did not read about the tarot tradition. I did not study tarot symbolism, but as somebody who was impassioned with psychology and as somebody who resonated with the idea that psychology is really the study of soul, I just got curious and I experimented by applying everything that I was learning as a psychotherapist to playing with the cards. So I applied family systems, hypnotherapy, brief strategic therapy, dream work. I would just take everything I was learning, and every time I learned a new thing, I would play with the cards to see how that would work. And in many ways, it would have been easier, as I was a young intern, to put this very strange pursuit aside. But I kept finding that when I would use the cards with people, I would get more revealed and oftentimes more insight with them and significant shifts than would take me weeks to months to sometimes years of psychotherapy. And so these experiences helped me to jump over my insecurity And I continued to pursue therapy ever since, and I integrated it very quickly with my practice.
Yeah. I just find it remarkable that even as a novice therapist in a conventional therapy program, while you were training, you kept the channel to deep intuition open and allowed the creative muse to come through. And you married tarot to that formal training in such a unique way. And I'm wondering, Lauren, if you can start to bring this method to life for us by sharing a case example.
I'd love to. I mean, first, I do want to say that, again, I did not know what I was doing. So I apprenticed myself to the material, and it kept leading me. And what I discovered is even accidents were just part of the creative process. It's the one place I never worry about making an accident because it becomes a discovery. So let me share about the method, and I'll share a case with that. I'm going to start by saying that unlike traditional tarot readings, I use about 40 decks because I discovered that when people choose the deck, they have more emotional resonance with it. And also the synchronicity, this correlation between the person and the particular image that comes up, is astounding. I also don't use a set format or definitions for the symbols. I ask people, this is a way of counseling our own deep inner wisdom. It's a way of accessing the unconscious. So I ask people how many cards they need to look at, how they're laid out, what the meaning of each placement is, and then I have them shuffle the deck and randomly choose cards. There are a couple of cases where I have them consciously choose cards, and I'll share one of those. But I'm going to jump in with this case. So this is a story about Susan. Susan came in to see me because she was deeply depressed. She was in her early 50s. She had just been fired from a job. And although she was an extremely competent woman, she was feeling completely overwhelmed, helpless, inadequate, and depressed. As Susan and I began to talk, I understood also that she had lost some significant family members in the last couple of years, and that there was a lot of grief along with that depression, and that she hadn't spoken to her family about it. But I often find that it's really helpful to use therapy when the doorway to somebody's unconscious is closed, either due to depression or trauma, or because they're just not inwardly reflective. So I invited Susan to use the cards, and I asked her to take a deep breath and ask herself how many cards she needed to see, and she said 2. And then I asked her, how are they laid out? And she laid them out side by side in her mind. And I asked her what the meaning of each placement was, and I diagrammed this before she even picked a deck. And so she said, 1 is the problem and 1 is the solution. And then she chose the Tarot of Paris deck and laid the cards after shuffling face down like this. So when we turn them upright, this is what they look like. And now I'm going to focus on the card for the problem. Now, when we approach cards, just like when we work with dreams, I don't have a preconceived idea of what the meaning is. In fact, when somebody first turns up a card, I often think, oh my gosh, I don't know what it means, and I'm being paid to know. But I want to encourage all of you to sit with this moment of not knowing, because the moment of not knowing is so important to let our ego step aside. And then you allow the card or allow the images to reveal themselves to you. And you just allow whatever image to catch your attention. So what caught my attention first in this card was the chessboard that everything is standing on. And so I asked Susan, is chess meaningful to you? And she said, oh yes, my father taught all of us, all the children, chess. And then I, of course, saw this very prominent Napoleon figure and asked, is Napoleon or a dictator important to you in some way? And she said, oh yes, my father was a dictator. My father would come home unhappy from his job every day and proceed to drink. And by the time we sat down for dinner, he was very drunk and very angry. And so he would criticize all of us, and I would hear how stupid I was and how I didn't know anything. And then Susan realized that this critical voice of her father was what she was carrying with her throughout her adulthood, and that when she got fired, that's what overcame her. So now I'm going to go to the image of the solution. Well, the minute Susan saw this image, she was breathtaken by this radiant crown in the middle and the Eiffel Tower behind it, which she had a love for Paris. And she immediately felt this hope. And then I pointed out to her the caduceus that you can see in the upper corners of both corners of the card. And the caduceus is our sign for the medical profession. And with that, she felt she could see her own capacity for healing reflected back to her. So this is an example how the images themselves can be enlivening. The images themselves can bring hope to somebody who's not seeing clearly or depressed or confused. And she began to look at very closely at the image of the Eiffel Tower and to focus on these connectors that hold up the structure. And she realized that it was connection that was so important to her. So she began to call people in her family after our session and talk to them more deeply about what had gone on. And then she planned for a trip back home. And I gave her Xeroxes of the cards. So she took them home and reflected on them every day. And a week later, I saw a very different woman in my office. She was absolutely elated. And she had come up with her own treatment plan by reflecting on the image. As she looked at these small connectors, she realized that if she just took one small step at a time, by changing her diet, by exercising, by being in touch with friends again, by calling her old bosses, which she did, and thanked them for her jobs, and by that, she got a better job. By following the images and her insights that came up from the images, Susan recreated a very satisfying life for herself.
Oh, every time I hear that story, I think of it as a gorgeous example of the spontaneous healing power of images. Can you expand on that, Lauren?
Yeah, image is the root of imagination. And it's also the mother language of our unconscious. So our unconscious communicates to us through images and metaphors. Therefore, when you incorporate images into either your therapy practice or your own personal spiritual practice, you immediately access the unconscious, which is this wellspring of wisdom. And at the core of our being, we have wholeness, resilience, and competency. So what the images do is they very often can reflect our own healing capacity back to us. Also, the image is a medium for intuition to flow between client and therapist or facilitator, or to access and stimulate your own imagination. So all of a sudden, you're not focusing on the problem, which has usually become stuck in your mind. You're not trying to use just your rational mind in solving life's challenges. You're stimulating imagination to bring a whole new set of possibilities to the forefront.
Also, this is one of many examples that you write about in your book in which people experience all the time in Tarotpy of synchronicity. With Susan, the chessboard, the Napoleon figure, the caduceus images, in the card she pulled are examples of synchronicities. In this context, we've talked about this. Synchronicity refers to a specific and meaningful correlation between the image and the person. And you've, as I said, picked some gems to illustrate that concept in your book. One of the most amazing examples is about the person you call Lucy. Can you tell her story?
Yeah, I'd love to. Let me start with the story and then we'll talk a little more about the synchronicity. So I, for about 25 years, ran dream groups for training therapists and also for lay people. And Tarotpy is like dreaming with your eyes open. These images come from the same deep pool and from the depths of psyche as dreams. So if somebody does not remember a dream in a dream group, I will invite them to use Tarotpy. And this was a case with Lucy where she was in a dream group for training therapists. She did not remember a dream, so I invited her to use Tarotpy. And again, I started by asking her, let me get to that image, to take a deep breath and to ask herself, how many cards do you need to look at? And she said 7. And then I said, could you take another deep breath and see how are they laid out in your mind's eye? And then I diagram what somebody tells me. And then she picked a deck, shuffled, and laid the cards out as if it was a body. She picked the Neuzeug deck, which means New Age Tarot. It's a German deck. And I'm going to focus on the card that came up for what she called her heart center. So this is the card. Now, you see that it's the King of Swords. Here's an example. If we had just used a typical deck, like the Rider-Waite, which you see on the right, the Rider-Waite is the most common deck, and most tarot will be illustrated in this way. When you say a King of Swords, he'll be in Renaissance clothing and have a sword. But when you have a dream character show up, or when you have a character in tarot show up, or Tarotpy, because I use many, many decks, including dream cards, soul cards, angel cards, if you have a character showing up, we can get a general idea of what this might be about. This is an older gentleman, so it might be a boss, it might be a father figure, it might be an authority figure, but we need to focus on the exact details of the image so that we can really learn about this character in a much more personal way and what gifts this character brings to this particular person. Well, so if you look at the King of Swords on the left, which Lucy picked, you'll notice he's very different. He's wearing earphones. He's in communication with people outside of himself. He's got a missile. He's got a podium, and underneath it says nuclear and the atom. Well, as a matter of fact, Lucy said, my father is a scientist. He's a nuclear scientist who works with the atom. So there we were dealing with her father at her heart center. And the group asked Lucy, why do you think your father's showing up now? And she said, well, my father is a very important role model for me, and he's very supportive of me, but he does tend to favor the intellect over emotions. And she said that can be a little problematic. As a training therapist, as a woman, she needed to also trust her emotional intelligence as much as her intellect. And so I asked Lucy if she wanted to move her father off her heart center and perhaps pick something else to represent that. She said no. But this therapy session stimulated a whole series of dreams in which her father moved next door. And she realized that she was developing a more equal relationship with her dad. And also she was developing a more equal relationship between her head and her heart, her emotional intelligence.
You know, it's incredible how Lucy chose such an unusual King of Swords card, unique really, with imagery and words connected to nuclear science, and then blindly places them in the heart of the layout. I mean, if this were simply a game of chance, what would be the chances of such a specific and personally meaningful pattern emerging? You know, I'm also struck by the fluid interplay between the images from the dream and the images that come up in a therapy session, which is its own form of synchronicity, really. So, Lauren, what would you say is the healing medicine or the real life benefit of synchronicity?
Well, you've articulated it so beautifully, Judy, and I'd love to unpack some of what you said. So how is it that these amazing synchronicities happen when somebody chooses a deck? Because I find that when they choose out of 40 decks, it's as if they've handed a paintbrush to spirit to paint an image of exactly who they are, because the synchronicities are so exact. And we can look at it in a couple different ways. Jung said that the self is an organizing principle, which means that at the deepest part of our true selves, we organize the events around us. Consciousness shapes events. And so it's this unconscious antenna that is guiding us to pick the deck, and then somehow picking the card that we need to bring up whatever's relevant for our emotional, psychological, spiritual growth. The other way of seeing it is that synchronicity is an extraordinary experience that makes us feel like we're connected, like my insides and my outsides connect when I see an image that is so particular to me. My sense of dreaming and waking are connected. Psyche and matter are connected. It's an extraordinary experience that gives us a sense of everything being connected. And it gives us an experience even of something greater than ourselves, as if there's an unconscious mastermind or invisible mastermind organizing the cards in a way that helps us to grow. So it's as if the universe is an intelligent, alive consciousness that is participating in our growth and evolution. It's a very powerful experience. It also is so powerful, it takes people out of their ordinary, logical, everyday kind of thinking, and it puts us in touch with a very enlarged sense of self.
Yeah, that's beautiful. I know that I've been really wowed and moved and shifted when I've worked a Tarotpy session and pick a card that somehow relates precisely to an image that I've already had in a dream and worked, and it deepens the meaning for that image for me in terms of my life.
It does.
So,
it creates a sense of wholeness and cohesiveness in our lives. You know, so many times we go into therapy or we approach a spiritual practice because we're confused and need guidance. And what happens with a synchronicity like this is it gives us a sense of a cohesive narrative. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And it strengthens our trust in our intuition. And each time I find that I do it, it strengthens my ability to follow this guidance.
Right, right. And I think that that's particularly needed at this time, you know, for individuals who are experiencing maybe an increase in fear and grief and despair. There's a greater sense of order, meaning, and possibility when you lay out the cards in such a meaningful way. And also, yeah, it's particularly important now. So I'm going to pivot a bit. Did you want to say something?
Well, I just want to say again, it's always astounding to me that if somebody comes in feeling fragmented and, you know, might have an overwhelming crisis, first of all, I trust the process. I'm going to be transparent here. As a therapist, if somebody comes in so overwhelmed by a crisis that frightens me, like a child trying to commit suicide, you know, something's really, really horrifying, that I would be overwhelmed along with them. But when I do therapy, that part of me steps aside. I trust the process. I trust the images to guide us. And what's amazing is, even though that person's fragmented, when I ask them how many cards they need to look at, it's oftentimes very harmonious, like 4 cards, 5 cards with 1 in the middle. And the images themselves are so symmetrical and balanced. And you get to see over and over again that there is this balance and harmony within us that we just need to tap into. Yeah. It's that still center that can help guide us through these very challenging times.
So, yeah, it's particularly important during these times. Um, I want to just acknowledge, Lauren, that you work with a range of people, from deeply spiritual seekers to rationalistic skeptics. Can Tarotpy work with someone who doesn't believe in synchronicity, tarot, spirit, or even the wisdom of the unconscious?
I've worked with corporate people who are very rational, do not remember their dreams, and walk in quite skeptical. I've worked with all kinds of people. I find that Tarotpy works every time. I had one case where it didn't, and may talk about that if I can, but this was one of my favorite referrals because it was somebody who absolutely didn't understand anything about what I was doing, but she was desperate. I'll call her Marnie. So Marnie was referred to me by Dr. John Horton, who loved Tarotpy and would collaborate with me with his patients. And he had been seeing Marnie for a while. Marnie was a very competent woman who had the perfect life, the perfect husband, the perfect children, until one day her husband came to her and said he was having an affair and was leaving. And so he left, and Marnie's entire world was blown apart. Marnie fell apart. She couldn't function well. She went to her HMO and was working with a therapist for a couple months, but there wasn't any change. She couldn't sleep. She could barely eat. And so Dr. Horton suggested that she come see me for therapy. And he tried to explain to her what I was doing, but I don't think it made sense to her that I was using tarot for psychotherapy. And she was desperate, so she came. And again, I asked Marnie how many cards she needed to see, how were they laid out. But let me start by saying I understood that Marnie's entire world had been blown apart and that Marnie's sense of reality had been blown. So I did not want to blow Marnie's mind with any kind of woo-woo. I was very careful to say to her that Tarotpy is a projective tool, that it simply helps us to get in touch with our emotional inner resources through projection. And so I laid it out in a very logical way, which it is. It's a very practical tool. Marnie picked 2 cards, and these were the cards. Actually, she picked 4. I'm going to show you 2 of them. Oh, hang on, I'm not getting screen here. There they are. All right, so she picked 1 for her husband and 1 for her marriage. You can see on the left, the one for her husband is a man passionately kissing a dark-haired woman. This did not fit the image of the redhead that was in my office. So Marnie, it brought up exactly what was going on for her with her husband. It freaked her out. She got more anxious. Then she looked at the image of the marriage and she saw this woman jumping over a huge hole in the ground. And it made her think about how the floor had fallen out from under her. And it just made her more anxious. I pointed out that the woman had leaped across the hole and seemed to have made it to the other side. That didn't seem to matter. I also asked about the kangaroos in the background. I pay attention to every detail and ask for associations or offer my own associations. Like, it makes me think of mothers. Do you have support around you with other mothers? Well, Marnie had a good group of friends, but again, she couldn't focus on that. All she could ask was, how do I get him back? How do I get him back? How do I get him back? And I would try to tell her that she was giving away her power because she couldn't control whether or not he came back. And I could have talked until I was blue in the face. There was nothing she would hear from me. So I finally said to Marnie, would you consciously look through a deck and pick a card for what you need? So Marnie picked up the Mother Peace deck, which I thought was an interesting choice since she really did need to connect to herself as a mother. And she looked through all the cards and she chose this card. You can see the snake is circling this woman with a very protective barrier, and that she's got 2 babies, like Marnie had 2 children, to her breast. So I asked Marnie, what does the card mean to you? And she said, I don't know. And I said, well, let me offer what I think. I think your unconscious showed you exactly what you need to heal, which is you need to put a really protective barrier around you and your two babies. And once you do that, you'll be stable and you and they will be okay no matter what happens. Well, she didn't want to hear that. She was very angry. She left the session very angry. I didn't know if I'd been helpful at all. And I'm going to stop share and just tell you the punchline of the story, which is that a month later, I saw Dr. Horton and I asked how Marnie was doing because I had called her about a week after the session, but she didn't call back. And he said, well, it was kind of amazing. About a week after she saw you, she pulled it together and she was fully running her life again. And he said, but the amazing thing that happened was a couple weeks after she saw you, a sinkhole opened up in her backyard. And I thought, oh my God, that must have freaked her out so much. No wonder she didn't call me back. And this is the thing, is even when I try to keep the woo-woo out of the session, it has a way of sneaking in.
Yeah. Incredible. She chose those images, Lauren, in spite of what she didn't want to know, in spite of how she felt. You might even say that the images picked her, in a certain way. She couldn't consciously hear the message, but these images were there and somehow had an effect on her over time, to help her move into forward movement in her own life and to access her own resources.
Right. Well, this is where we see that the image breaks through conscious blocks, and that even though she couldn't consciously get the message, her unconscious picked exactly what she needed and understood what she needed.
Right. I also think that case highlights the difference between a typical tarot reading and a Tarotpy session. So had she walked into a tarot reader's room, that reader might have kept Marnie's question in the same literal and narrow frame she came in with. How can I get my husband back? What can I do to get him back? From my point of view, that's a kind of superficial paint by numbers approach, but I love the way you ask open-ended questions for a Tarotpy session. So for example, just generally, like, what do I need to know about my current crisis? That open-ended frame lets greater wisdom come through, greater wisdom than the person is aware of in the moment, and helps her look at her problem from a different, more expansive perspective. In Marnie's case, getting her man back was not her central issue, or it was not within her power. There was a huge difference between what she would have heard from, a very practiced tarot reader and someone practiced in Tarotpy. The solution, if she had gone to a traditional tarot reading, might have been a facelift, for example, something like that.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
If I could say that this is an example of how I rolled my hypnotherapy training into working with therapy, is that I trust therapy and dream work has the same principle of this deep trust in the psyche, that the psyche is whole, that we are essentially whole and creative, that we have the answers within, that we can get ourselves stuck. But anyway, I was trained in this way of working with hypnosis where you would tell a story. I would have to create a story within the session with embedded metaphors that would reach somebody's unconscious and help to untangle whatever belief systems they had that were getting in the way of their flow. And I could do it, but it was hard in the middle of a session to create this story. But what I found with the therapy is that when a person is shuffling cards, they're putting themselves into a relaxed state. They're taking their focus off of the problem, which usually is what gets them stuck, because they're just trying to solve something with a limited perspective and a conscious, rational, linear perspective. So this takes their focus off the problem. And when they're focusing on the cards on the table, they're moving into an intuitive, non-rational state. And all of a sudden, the metaphors start to just lift off of the material itself. So that I didn't have to create the story with the embedded metaphors. I trust that the cards are going to give the client and me the metaphors that they need to find their way out of a box.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think that's a good segue to something that I wanted to re-emphasize, something you brought up at the outset before we wrap up our conversation. And that I want to preface it by saying that, Tarotpy is your baby. You created it, and you're particularly gifted and practiced in using it, of course. But I think one of the main reasons you wrote this book is that you are passionate in your view that the healing power of the method lies not in the hands of a psychic diviner or a magician, but rather in the images and how they present themselves synchronistically. Now, what follows from that is that no matter who you are, whether you're a therapist or a layperson or someone who wants to help others or yourself or both, it doesn't matter. Anyone can learn this method.
So I do know that anyone can develop their intuitive muscles. And I wrote the book in a way that was interweaving my case studies with personal stories and exercises, from starting with the simplest therapy method, like picking one card or those two cards for balance, to a more complicated layout, so that the book takes you step by step in learning this process, this methodology. And I've been very excited to get feedback from people, from therapists, from lay people calling me and saying, I'm doing the exercises and it's working. So I'm just delighted to know that the book works. And people can practice it on their own. They can use the book to teach them the method. They can form groups and use the book as their guideline to learn therapy. I think I really encourage groups because when you get a multiple projections on your own image, it brings up a lot of different perspectives. It's very helpful. And then I train people in enduring therapy as well.
That's great. And at the end, you're going to share more specific opportunities for follow-up. So we open it up to questions for other people.
Right.
Ellen?
Yeah.
Yeah.
If you would please put questions in chat, we'd appreciate it. But we have a couple to start out with. First of all, a question about the Marnie case study and the deck you're using, the Mother Peace deck. What were the two specific cards that you asked her to choose, and how did that work?
Oh, so the first deck she chose was called the Dream Card deck. And I asked her just to select a deck that attracted her attention. That's what she chose. And she shuffled it and randomly picked those first two images, the one for the husband and the one for her marriage. When I asked her to consciously pick a card, she picked the Mother Peace deck, looked through the whole deck, and then picked that image of the woman with the snake around her. Does that answer the question?
Yes. Thank you, Lauren. It was two decks then.
That was two decks.
Yeah. Okay, and then a question and a statement. The tricky thing is to avoid thinking that therapy is predictive. It's about
Absolutely.
images and what they do for the patient. Isn't that right?
Absolutely. So I am very careful to avoid anything that sounds predictive. And there's a story early on, it's rather a funny situation, where I was asked to do a fundraiser at my daughter's school, and I was asked to play the part of the gypsy. So I was in a situation where being a gypsy and making predictions would have been quite expected of me. But the first person who approached me at the table was somebody who said, first of all, do you do this for real, or is this just a game? And I said, no, I'm actually a therapist and I do this for real. And he said, okay, I want to know, am I going to die from this brain tumor, and is my business going to go under? And I said, those are very serious questions, and this isn't really the setting for it. So I sort of sidestepped by sending him over to the other tarot reader. But he came back in a little while and said, I'll tell you what he said if you'll read my cards. And so what I did was very carefully look at what are the social, emotional issues around these serious challenges he's facing. I will always look at it in an open-ended way, as Judy said, to find out what's going on emotionally and psychologically. And
No, her fell down.
I just saw an interesting question about somebody saying, I pull the devil card pretty often. That would be another thing that we would do, is not take a literal definition of what somebody might think of as the devil, but start to talk about the details of a particular devil that shows up and how the devil can be something that has got you captive. What would that be? Again, talking about it not in a literal way, but in a metaphoric way.
So another question. Do you do therapy sessions by Zoom, and could you speak to how you do those?
I do. It's been tricky to learn how to do this. I'm sure everybody has found it quite tricky to learn how to live their lives and their professions on Zoom this last almost 2 years. I did have to figure out how to use therapy on Zoom. And what I do is I ask the person who's consulting to bring a deck or decks with them. And I will have them walk them through the process of picking how many cards they need to look at, laying the cards out in front of them, and then have them take a picture of that layout and send it to me, text it to me, so that we're both looking at the layout. I run a group. Oops, I'm hearing someone. I run a group of therapy practitioners online as well, and they're much more savvy than I am about working on the computer, and they'll put their images up on the screen and then share them so the whole group can talk about them. So there's different ways to do it. I find if somebody doesn't have a deck, there's a great site called askthecards.info. I'll say it again, askthecards.info. Oh, thank you, Panda, for putting it up. It's a great site that has, I don't know, maybe 100 decks, and you can scroll through so that you can get a sense of what decks attract you. And they can pick a deck on that site, and then they can electronically do a layout. The only problem with that is the layout is a set format. So it's not, they're unconscious laid out on the table in their own design, but we can still work with the images and see what they mean to them. So there's all kinds of ways that we can fudge this on Zoom, and it works.
So a question from Ananya. Do you have the client pick an image or pick it blind with the images turned over?
Could you ask that again?
How do you work with clients in terms of them picking an image from what they see versus picking an image blind, just for all the cards turned over?
So I generally will ask somebody to trust the process of randomly picking the images. But sometimes somebody wants to pick it consciously, and that's okay. I have a story of somebody coming in to see me early on when I was just doing therapy by word of mouth. And she asked me, as she stepped into the room, she said, should I marry this man? So she was asking for a prediction. She was asking me to tell her what to do. And I had a crazy idea. She was wearing a shawl, and I said, do you want to use that shawl and lay the cards out on the shawl? And she got goosebumps and said, oh my God, my boyfriend gave me that shawl. And I knew she was looking at me as if I had a turban on my head. And I thought, oh dear, she really is going to expect me to tell her what to do. And so I suggested to her that she look through the deck and consciously pick the cards. And she said, oh, no, I don't want to do that. I want you to tell me. And I said, that's why I'm asking you to consciously pick the cards. And so she did. She consciously picked cards. And what she picked for the relationship was the Lover's card. Well, the Lover's card is a very sensible card to pick to represent a relationship. But in the Lover's card that she picked, there were two women of the same age on either side of a man. Again, I pay attention to the details. I asked her, is there some reason that there's two women in this image with the man in the middle? And she said, oh, yes, he's married. And so then we got into, well, the issue isn't really whether you should marry him, but is he going to leave his marriage? And then we got into looking at why she picked somebody who was not available. And it just opened a whole bunch of insights for her, and she could make clear choices. But that's an example of, there are times where if somebody doesn't trust the randomness, they may want to trust themselves to pick the cards, but they will still get insights because the unconscious may see something that the conscious mind wasn't seeing.
We have a couple more questions, Lauren. Here's the first. As a Jungian coach, could I use Tarotpy during a shadow session?
Oh my gosh, absolutely. That would be great. Obviously, we don't see our shadow very quickly, so bringing up different images might present aspects of the shadow that somebody hadn't considered. Even when we talk about the shadow, we oftentimes think about the negative aspects of ourselves. I've had people pick cards where they're radiant, where there are regal figures, and that the shadow is the beauty that they don't see in themselves. So I think it would be invaluable. And I would love to hear, if you do try it, how that works for you.
So let me read you this next one. Does it matter if you shuffle, keeping the cards all upright, or is it okay to split the deck and put them together, rendering some cards upside down?
Wow, that's complex. What I'm hearing is you're asking about rituals and what happens if you try this and try that. And I'm just going to encourage you to try exactly what you just described. And again, I'm going to remind everybody, I started Tarotpy without any idea what I was doing. And part of Tarotpy, what created Tarotpy, was a lot of play and curiosity and creativity and experiment. So when you have a thought like this, give it a try, see what happens. There isn't a set rule about it. This is one of the things I love about Tarotpy. It's to break the rules that we are raised with about how to do something correctly. And that's even in the tarot tradition, where when I first started, I was told that you needed to split the deck 3 times and then put it back together because that's some sort of an ancient ritual. I think ritual is beautiful, and Tarotpy is a ritual for me. It's a spiritual ritual. So if you want to light a candle, you want to break the deck, you want to do something ritualistic to bring yourself more fully into the moment, into a sacred space, do it, try it. I hope that answers your question. If there was a second thought behind it, please ask.
So I just wanted to add something.
Thank you, Leslie.
Oh.
Yes. Just a lovely comment and welcome.
Oh.
Go ahead.
Just that, even if you think the cards are upright, all of them are upright, lots of times cards present themselves upside down. I've had that experience a couple of times, and it's always meaningful. So it's really, there is some kind of force beyond our rational control that allows for the cards that are needed to emerge in the form that they are needed.
The other thing is to really look at the shapes of the cards, not again in their literal sense. I used to always turn a card right side up when I got it upside down, because I would think about it as I'm not able to access the gifts that this figure brings because it's upside down to me. So let me look at it right side up and see what it has to offer me. But I do work with people that keep it upside down, and they've taught me to really notice the form. Like if there's a cup upside down, what is it about spilling out that is important for this moment, rather than trying to contain everything upright? It's amazing. I'll have people pick from 5 decks. And as we begin to look at each card, you'll see the same image being picked up from one card to the next, even though it's 5 different decks. So you stop thinking of them in a literal sense. For those who do tarot, it's about breaking that form a little bit. So you're not just thinking about what it means, but really noticing shapes, patterns, colors, how the patterns harmonize or how they speak to each other in a layout.
So another question, I will just read it. What if someone doesn't believe in woo-woo? And you touched on that a little bit earlier, a bit more. Lauren did an intervention with my family, and my then 70-year-old mathematician father was resistant, but was ultimately blown away with the potency of the process. He pulled the chariot, and that was meaningful to all of us. So I think really to say more about how you can work with people that start out very resistant.
Well, again, I want to respect people's worldview and philosophies when they come in. So I'm not going to impose woo-woo on anyone. And again, I look at therapy as both a very practical tool for projection. So I might present it that way, that this is a tool that allows us to just focus our attention. Like in meditation, when you do like meditation where you focus on a word, where you focus on the light, it's a way of focalizing the attention. So I will use the cards to focus our attention instead of wandering just randomly around the room. And we project ourselves onto it like a Rorschach. Thanks for that word. So it can be a very practical tool. And for therapists or for anybody that feels like they're not comfortable with spirituality or they don't believe in the synchronicity, they can use it in that way. Because again, images speak to the unconscious, activate the imagination, and help us then to get creative problem solving. And I have found that even with very rationally minded people, it always works. But very often they're led by the session itself or by the cards to consider that there's something even more in it, because very often there is a synchronicity that surprises them.
Can you please say a little more about how to apply therapy to dream work?
Well, I do see therapy as a waking dream. So again, in the example that I used, you can use therapy when you're not remembering dreams, and it'll often stimulate more dream recall, more vivid dreaming. So for dreamers who are frustrated because they're not remembering their dreams, try a therapy session to start unblocking you in terms of getting in touch with your dreams. The other thing is that you can use therapy to get further guidance on a dream. So without going into a full story about it, I'm trying to think of how to say this succinctly. I had somebody who had a dream that indicated there was a medical problem. And she ended up asking to do a therapy session to get further guidance on the dream. And I thought, before she came into the session, I thought, how are we going to talk about that this dream is really bringing up something very serious medically, and might be how asking her to get in touch with her mortality. I didn't know how to bring that up. The whole group had sidestepped it. But then she used the cards, shuffled, randomly put 2 cards down, and the cards showed her that her head was disconnected from her body, and the other card was a death card. And it wasn't like this is a prediction that you're going to die. It's simply that it put her in touch with the seriousness of the medical issue, and that her head, she was really disconnected from her body, and that's why she wasn't paying enough attention. So it made her pay attention, it made her confront her doctors, and then she got the right care and she recovered. You can always get further guidance on a dream with using cards.
You mentioned a group that might use Tarotpy. Is that for psychotherapists only? Can you say more about it?
Well, for years I ran a group for psychotherapists, but in the last 15 years, I've run groups or done workshops to teach Tarotpy, and I don't limit it to psychotherapists. I don't distinguish whether somebody is a healer but without a license, but very gifted healer, or if somebody is a layperson who's wanting to use this for their own spiritual, psychological development. I don't limit it. And I do a training that's training for Tarotpy practitioners. And I provided CEUs for therapists, but again, I didn't limit it to therapists. So I'm looking at this as a tool that people can use if they want to work with clients, whether or not they're licensed. And then if they want to work on their own, again, for psychotherapists, one of the best ways to learn how to trust Tarotpy is learning to use it for yourself. So no, I haven't limited to just therapists anymore. I'll teach people, because I find that then they all get a lot from each other, and they're not only thinking of it within a therapeutic context.
So Lauren, this is a good segue to talk a little more about opportunities with you to learn more.
Okay, I'm going to share my screen again. I'm going to offer two I'm going to be doing 2 introductions to Tarotpy. That's a 3-hour workshop where we'll go through several different kinds of techniques of Tarotpy, and people will have an opportunity to pull cards for themselves and to practice, both as a group, and then we get into dyads so that people can work with each other. I'm going to be doing that January 8th and January 22nd. And after that, if you're interested in that, you can email me. If you have questions that I haven't answered today, please email me. If you have questions coming up in the future, please email me about it. If you try Tarotpy on your own and you want to share what goes on for you, please do. And you can also go to my website to learn more about it. I'm also going to be offering that practitioner's training sometime in the new year. And I hope to offer a group that will teach strictly to the book, because the book is designed as a 7-part workshop, where, as I said, it will go from the most simple technique, like pulling 1 card, to learning how to look at 2 cards to get balance or perspective, to doing a full layout. And finally, the 7th chapter, which is called a progressive layout. It's the most complicated. I couldn't explain it by talking about a case. And so I used my own example of how I leaned into Tarotpy and used the progressive layout to walk me through a very difficult situation where my mom was declining with dementia. And I leaned into my own tools as if my life depended on it, because I felt it did. And it did save my life. It walked me through a very difficult situation. So the last chapter is my own work, which is another thing about Tarotpy, is that I believe that it's important not to use it on a hierarchical level. I'm the expert and somebody else isn't, but that we're all learning from it in the process of doing it.
So we're almost out of time. We have another minute. Final comments, Judy or Lauren?
Oh, well, I just want to thank you, Lauren, for really taking the time to share your life's work and passion with everybody. And hopefully they just have a taste of what you can do with the very particular Tarotpy method that you have developed. I've seen you work it in groups. I've worked with you individually. And I also have to say, I can really bear witness to how you have used Tarotpy in your own life to help strengthen you and give you guidance. So I hope that other people will buy the book, read the book, and take advantage of all of the follow-up opportunities that you've described.
Thank you. I'm so grateful to you all for joining us, and hope you've gotten some more understanding of Tarotpy from this. And the book is an interweaving of incredibly colorful and inspiring stories, and I hope that you will enjoy it. And my daughter's here, and I'm just going to shout out to Hannah. It's so awesome to see you from Germany, and to everyone. It's wonderful to be with you.
And could we get that email put in chat, please?
Yes. Let me go ahead and put that in.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone. Happy holidays. And hopefully we will connect in another form. Take care.
Thank you. Thanks, Lauren. Bye.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Bye.